Hello YouTube. So this is my first massive tutorial, but it's the second time I've tried to upload this tutorial. The first time my voice completely dropped out, so you may have been able to follow along, but you would have only have heard the instrument sounds, and my voice was about 40 decibels lower. So if you were very brave and you could listen to one part of it very loudly, you may have been able to follow along. But anyway, I'm going to try again. So this is the first massive tutorial, and it's the one oscillator tutorial. And the reason I wanted to do this video, in case you didn't hear it the first time around, is that I've seen a lot of tutorials on YouTube for massive, and it was a synthesizer I wanted to get into. It was a VST I wanted to get into because it looks very interesting. It's actually fairly easy to use once you know the basics, but getting the basics is not necessarily the most intuitive. And I've also heard some amazing sound in the preset, but if you don't really know what's going on, it's quite difficult sometimes to edit presets in a way that's predictable. So I've started to use it now as a bit of a go-to synth in my to build up basic sounds and even some quite interesting pads and things. So I think it's an excellent VST. It's probably underused because it's part of the Contact Complete package, and when you get that, you tend to play around with the Contact player a lot more. And Absinthe gets a lot of use as well. This one you may overlook if you've already got a bunch of VSTs, but this is it's really worth getting into. So in this tutorial, all I'm going to really do is focus on a single oscillator patch. We're going to use one oscillator, filter, and we're going to use envelope and LFO. And now if you want to start in exactly the same way that I have and follow along, just go to File here and New Sound, and it should reset the synthesizer or the VST in a way that you can see on the screen. If you see something different down here, just click on this blue LFO, this blue envelope icon here, and you'll see this. You might see something like this instead. Just click on this envelope. Okay, so let's get going. Once you start using this instrument, the layout does actually become extremely intuitive, and you realize exactly what it's doing. But because so many virtual instruments are set up in very different ways, all of which they claim are intuitive, when you first look at Massive, it looks a little bit overwhelming, but really it's not. So down the left-hand side here, you basically have your sound generators, your oscillators. I'm going to assume that you know at least something about analog synthesis and subtractive synthesis. Otherwise, this might be a little bit difficult to follow along. But basically, down here you have three oscillators that can generate sounds and a modulation oscillator. Now, in order for one of these to be active, you have to actually click the name, and when the blue light comes on, that means it's active. So at the moment, I've got everything deactivated except this oscillator one. Actually, noise is activated. I'm going to just take that off. And within the oscillator itself, again, it's reasonably straightforward when you know what you're doing. There's a little drop down here, and these are all of the waveforms that you can use. There's basic waveforms, virtual analog, and then I think these are all pretty much samples, but these basic waveforms are the ones that we're going to be using here. And in fact, pretty much these five here are what you would expect to find on most analog synthesizers that you can buy. Now, some of these have two, which is a little bit confusing initially, but is pretty straightforward. So if you say take this square saw 1, what that means is that it has both a square and a saw wave in that oscillator, and you can basically move between the two using this position knob here. I have a little sequence here that I can just play just to demonstrate that. So if we just play this, so that's a saw. Sorry, that's a bigger button. That's a square. Sorry, I got completely confused there. So the initial one was a saw, and the one on the left is a square. So square to saw. So you can have either square or saw or a blend. So let's just do that again. We're going to start with square. So very simple. We're going to ignore this intensity knob just for this tutorial. We'll go back to that in a later tutorial. This here is the amp. So that's basically the volume of just this oscillator. over here on the right, you have the master, which is the volume of the entire instrument. And then finally, and this slide is quite important, this tells you how much of the signal is going to filter 1 as opposed to filter 2. And just for this tutorial, we're only going to use one filter. So filter 1, we're going to take off filter 2, and we'll get to the filter second. We'll get to the filter section in just a second. So this is how much of that signal goes to filter 1. So when you build more complex sounds, you can have oscillator 2 going to filter 2, and you can have oscillator 3 maybe going to both, and make more interesting sounds and have more control over your sounds. So in this filter section here, this is really, the backbone of analog synthesis. It's subtractive synthesis. So it's the sound sounds how in the way that you leave it. Basically how much of the sound you allow to go through. And the filter is one of the most powerful ways of influencing that. Sorry, that wasn't a very good explanation, but you get the idea. Now, there are a lot of filters here. We're really, just for this tutorial, probably going to use the low-pass filter, because that's the classic analog filter. But once you select a filter, you get a contextual modulators. These controls become contextual. So we've now got cutoff and resonance, because that's what you'd expect with a low-pass filter. If you have an all-pass filter, you get the same thing. This double notch, same thing. But if you use one of these kind of wacky filters, like you get a scream amount. I don't really know what that does, but you can probably figure it out. But for a traditional filter, you'd only expect to have cutoff and resonance. And this is what it would sound like. I'm going to take the resonance right down, the cutoff right up. So the cutoff right up obviously means you're letting all the sound through. As you bring it down on a low-pass filter, it means you're filtering out the highest frequencies first and coming down to the lowest frequencies, and it sounds like this. And basically, the character of any analog synthesizer is pretty much defined in many ways by the combination of the oscillator and the filter, and really nothing else. All of the other things that you get, such as effects, chorus, delays, and the other kinds of modulation, the LFOs, etc., add a lot to that. But the character of a synthesizer is defined by those two very basic things. And in massive, it is pretty straightforward. There's nothing interesting really going on there. But that's not really the power of this synth. The resonance piece just behaves in exactly the same way you would expect resonance to behave on any other synth. So again, if I just pop that up, you hear that characteristic squelching sound. If you don't know, all a resonance filter really does is that it amplifies the particular frequency that's just before the cutoff. So as you're going down the cutoff, the frequency that the cutoff filter is bumping up against at that point gets amplified, and that's why you get that whistling sound. If you turn the resonance right up to maximum, you will get what's called self-oscillation, so it almost sounds like a second oscillator. Or if you've got 3 oscillators going, it might sound like a 4th oscillator, or 4th, 5th, and 6th oscillator, depending on what's going on. This slider here, it actually took me a while to figure out what this does. This is really just how abruptly the filter affects the oscillator. So if you have this right down, it actually won't do anything, but you also really won't be able to hear anything. So I'm not really too sure why there's that second mix there. It does get confusing. I always just leave it on max. I've never felt any reason to bring this down. And this is really just the mix of the outputs of the two filters, which can override or intermingle with the mixes that you have on these amps and other settings. Again, just for now, I'm going to keep that on mix 1 because we're going to be completely on filter 1. The amp here should be completely self-explanatory. So although this bypass piece does get complicated, we'll look at that in a much later tutorial. But this is basically the master volume. That's the overall volume of the synth. What you will see, though, is that this amp modulation has got a little 4 in it, so is the bypass mod, but we can ignore that for now. What that means is that this is being affected by envelope 4. So envelope 4 is modulating the amp sound. So you can see that this waveform is, how the sound basically gets through the amp when you hit a note. It's pretty boring. It's a very fast attack, or a fairly moderately fast attack, not the fastest. The sound keeps going so long as you have the key held down, and then it drops off pretty much immediately when you let go of the key. So, very basic. And when you play this little sequence, it's pretty boring. Now, in Massive, you actually have quite a lot of controls around the filter, around the envelope, and we're going to really just look at it like a typical ADSR envelope, which is attack, decay, sustain, release. They call it something slightly different here. So you've got attack, which is pretty much the same as any old synthesizer, and then you have level, which is really how high the initial attack goes. So you can have a kind of a dual attack. So you can have the attack will go to this particular level, and then you can have the decay, which is usually how long something stays at a particular level, to actually still increase the volume. So there's quite a lot of flexibility there. But we're not going to look at this level initially because it does complicate things a little bit. But you just start to get an idea of how powerful Massive is. But the next modulation is the decay. So this is how long it will stay at that level before something else happens. Now, if you have the level all the way max, this doesn't make any difference. I can bring it right down, or I can push it all the way to the max. Doesn't make a blind bit of difference. But where it does make a difference is when you start to bring the level down. So it's basically how long it will stay at that level. So if I bring this right down, it just immediately sounds quieter. If I extend that a little bit, you hear that little peak at the start, and then it fades very quickly. Do it again. So it's quite subtle there. Let's drop this level a little bit. So it goes up to max, and then it slowly fades down to this level until you let go of the key. What release does is basically it when you've released the key, it allows the sound to fade off after the key has been released. It's basically after the key's been released. That's what you can think of this as. So if I have this at the lowest setting, so no matter what's going on here, as soon as I release the key, it just drops off. If I push this up to about halfway, it's a very different effect. And it starts to get a little bit more interesting. Okay, so if we play our sequence and just play around with this, you can hear what's going on. So now we have a slightly more interesting sound. And I'm going to leave it there just for now so that we can start doing some other things. So if I start changing the filter, cutoff, and the resonance while that's playing, you'll hear that we will get some slightly more interesting sounds. So let's do that. So now it's starting to get interesting and starting to sound like the familiar kind of analog sounds you might hear on something like Tangerine Dream or some other band. So that's all good so far. So we have a nice little envelope, which is pretty easy to control. There's a lot of other settings in the envelope that we'll get to when we start looking at pads and other more complex sounds. But for the time being, all we're going to do now is add some modulation to this filter to make this sound pretty nice, or at least a little bit more interesting. So if we go to the LFO section here, this is another extremely powerful section of Massive. There are many things you can do in here. It actually blew my mind when I started going into it, that just the number of modulation opportunities you get. But just very briefly, just the basics so that you can orient yourself if you're already used to synthesizers. Obviously, this is the LFO rate. The default setting is that it's a free rate, meaning it's regardless of what's going on in the tempo. The tempo here is 120. If you want to sync it to the tempo, you just hit a little key here. So now you have it synced. So what that means is that the LFO will move every 16th note, not every 16 notes. And you can change that, and you just basically click on the number and move the mouse up and down. So that's the sync button. The restart trigger is really interesting. Again, some analog synths had this early on, but a lot didn't. This basically tells it whether to restart the LFO wave every time a new note set, and you get a very different effect whether that's clicked or not. I'm going to leave it on restart just for now. This crossfade curve here basically it tells Massive whether or not to use this LFO or this LFO. I want to say LFO 1 or 2, but it's not really like that because they're not independent. They will follow the same timing and everything else, but you have basically two signals going to wherever you're sending this. Just for the now, we're going to use just this top one to keep things simple. And then we have different LFO curves here that you should be familiar with. So we've got sine wave, saw, square, triangle, etc. But there are other more complicated ones. So you get something like this, which is nice and crazy, but we're just going to keep it basic for now. And then we have some envelopes over here, which I'm going to get into in another tutorial because that adds quite a lot of complexity. So what you would do normally is that you would want the LFO to influence some other aspect of the sound, of the signal path. And one of the most common ones, obviously, is the cutoff frequency. So here we actually have quite a lot of control here. We can have a modulator just pulling the cutoff down. We can have the modulator pushing the cutoff up, or we can just have it pushing up and down, which is this SC. So that's basically saying that the source of the modulation is now LFO 5, and all I did was clicked on this and dragged it over. If you want to undo it, you just right click and say off. Okay, so I'm going to bring that in there. At the moment it's not actually going to do anything, because if I just hit play, there's nothing going on. What you have to do is you have to tell it how much to affect this by. So you do that by pushing this up or down, depending on which way you want it to go. So now I can see this is going to about the halfway point to fully open. Okay, so let's see what that sounds like. And that's completely in time with the tempo. So let's just change this and see what happens. Bear in mind, it's actually re-triggering the note every single time. It's re-triggering the LFO every time the note's re-triggered, because I have this restart on. If we take that off, it's much more free-form. Now that won't affect it when you've got a very high ratio, but if you bring the ratio very, very low, it will affect it, because the notes will be hit more quickly than the LFO can sequence through. So I'll show you what that sounds like. So that doesn't really change. And also, you can hear that when the envelope tailed off, when the envelope was tailing off, the LFO was still running a little bit. Now, the starting point of this modulation is basically wherever you have that cutoff. So if I put the cutoff right here, it will sound very different. So there you have it. So that's basically how you use one oscillator, a filter, and an envelope. And obviously with the number of waveforms that you have here, you can experiment with that, and you can just keep everything else the same and try it with different waveforms. It will sound very different. So if you move it back to the square wave, you actually get quite a different effect. You can have a bit of an experiment there. So just with one oscillator, one filter, one LFO, and one envelope, which is pretty much what you would have had 30 years ago, you can make some pretty decent, interesting sounds. So that's the end of the first massive tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please leave feedback if this was helpful or not helpful. It's all good. And give a thumbs up if you like it. Thanks a lot.